Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to the second lecture in our 2024 Bioethics Colloquium series hosted by Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I'm Michael Sleesman, Director of Bioethics Degree Programs, and I'm pleased to introduce this evening's lecture. If you missed our first lecture with Dr. Theo Boer 2 weeks ago on euthanasia and lessons from the Netherlands, it's now available on the TED's YouTube channel under the Bioethics Lectures playlist. As this is our second lecture in our series, I'll forego a lengthier introduction of our university and merely mention a few opportunities relevant to bioethics engagement here at Trinity. The first is to highlight the work of my colleagues at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, and most specifically, their upcoming 31st annual summer conference entitled The Future of Health, Faith, Ethics, and Our MedTech World. As one of the leading Christian bioethical venues for engagement, I would encourage you to attend their upcoming conference this June, either in person or virtually. To learn more about their summer conference and the center's work more broadly, please visit cbhd.org. The Divinity School, where I serve on the faculty, offers the MA in Bioethics degree, which can be completed in as few as 14 months through residential, hybrid, and/or online options. This degree, along with our graduate certificates in pro-life advocacy and engagement, and another in Hippocratic healthcare ethics, are designed with accessibility in mind for busy professionals and those with busy personal lives, allowing students to attend either in person or complete coursework remotely without requirements to come to our Deerfield campus. For more information about the bioethics degrees and related certificate options, please visit our university website at teds.edu/bioethics. The last thing I'll mention this evening is that Trinity also publishes the journal Ethics in Medicine, one of the oldest continually published bioethics journals, specifically from a Christian perspective. This journal is committed to exploring the connection between the legacy of the Hippocratic Oath and the wealth of the Christian tradition for the wide spectrum of bioethical issues. If you're interested in submitting an article, accessing the free archives, or becoming a subscriber, please visit the journal's website at ethicsinmedicine.com. Finally, I would like to invite you back for the John F. Kilner Endowed Lectureship, which will be delivered by Dr. Loris Kaljan on March 14th. More information on this upcoming free event is available on our Eventbrite page. Turning to this evening, Professor Allen's presentation will last about an hour, followed by Q&A. Those of you joining remotely can submit your questions at any time throughout the talk via the chat function on the YouTube live stream. Once Professor Allen finishes her presentation, we'll try to get to as many of your questions as our time will allow before our 8:30 conclusion. For those joining this lecture as part of a bioethics course here at Trinity, we will reconvene both here in the room as well as the remote Zoom session that I emailed the students earlier about, beginning around 8:45. And now to this evening's lecture. Our speaker this evening is Professor Adeline Allen, Associate Professor of Law at Trinity Law School, and she was recently appointed as an Associate Fellow with the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. We're grateful to Professor Allen for joining us this evening, as she is here on campus to participate in a consultation of the Center's Academy of Fellows, where she'll be presenting another paper tomorrow evening on donor conception. So again, I want to express my gratitude for her graciously taking on this additional speaking request when she had already committed to presenting something else, so thank you. Her scholarship focuses on the natural law foundations of contract law and the family, the view of the human person in bioethics, and the nature of contracting. She was a 2017-2018 visiting fellow at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, and has been published in a variety of venues, including the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, Public Discourse, and World. She and her family live in Southern California, where our law school is located. Will you please join me in welcoming Professor Allen as she presents This Incarnational Life, Surrogacy, and Christian Anthropology.
Well, thank you to TEDS and Professor Sleesman. I am very honored to be here with you all, and I bring greetings from the law school in Southern California to you. I think I may have brought this weather along. And thanks to TEDS and Professor Sleesman for welcoming me and inviting me here, even though I'm not a bioethics specialist. Also, surely I'm not the first one to point out that this is not a TED Talk, but a TED's Talk. Well, in 1953, C.S. Lewis wrote a letter. It's a reply letter to a woman named Vera Gebhardt. She had recounted to Lewis how she was pregnant, but she didn't know it. And she thought the reason she was sick was because she got seasick. And so I want to read a portion of Lewis's reply letter to her. He said, "Your first story about mistaking your pregnancy for seasickness is one of the funniest I ever heard. In our country, there are usually alterations of shape, which would throw grave doubts on the seasick hypothesis. But no doubt you manage things better in America. Anyway, congratulations and encouragements. As to wishing it had not happened, one can't help momentary wishes. Guilt begins only when one embraces them. You can't help their knocking at the door, but one mustn't ask them in to lunch. And no doubt you have many feelings on the other side. I am sure you felt as I did when I heard my first bullet. This is war. This is what Homer wrote about. For all said and done, a woman who has never had a baby and a man who has never been either in a battle or a storm at sea are, in a sense, rather outside, haven't really seen life, haven't served. We will indeed have you in our prayers," end quote. Well, I was reminded of that letter from C.S. Lewis when I was reading the New York Times about a month and a half ago at the LAX airport, of how Paris Hilton, the heiress, and her husband just had a baby through surrogacy. This is their second baby, born less than a year after they had their first baby, who was also born through surrogacy. The baby was a surprise to her family, and she revealed the surprise at a Thanksgiving family gathering. Now, here's what Paris Hilton said, and it's quoted all over news outlets. She said, "My parents did not know when it was happening. They just knew it was going to happen," end quote. Now, it struck me when I read that how odd that is for how anti-incarnational surrogacy is. Bless her heart, but Hilton's belly would have stayed as flat as ever throughout all those months that the baby was being gestated by the surrogate mother. No such alterations of shape, to use Lewis's polite phrasing, for Paris Hilton. Let us come back to this once we learn a little bit more about surrogacy. So, about surrogacy itself, here's a quick sketch of it and the people involved. How it works is the intended parents, or as I and some others prefer to call them, the commissioning parents, from all over the world would enter into a contract with a woman who will, through IVF, in vitro fertilization, be implanted with their genetic embryo. She then carries the baby to term, gives birth to the baby, and hands over the baby to the commissioning parents. They pay the woman, the baby goes home with them. Now, despite carrying the baby for 9 months, the birth mother has no right or responsibility to the child. And that's gestational surrogacy versus what used to be called just surrogacy, or now we call it traditional surrogacy, which would have used artificial insemination, and just about nobody else does that anymore. The market about surrogacy or of surrogacy, the global commercial surrogacy industry grew to an estimated $14 billion in 2022. I checked that figure, it's quoted in Forbes magazine a couple of times because that seems really high. That's billion with a B. By 2032, that figure is forecast to rise to $129 billion, no doubt taking into account inflation. But still, that's a big chunk of change. Who's contracting for this? And if you're wondering how this contract professor got into bioethics, this was the entry, because it's got contracts involved all over the place. But on the commissioning parent side, who's contracting? Couples, often infertile but not always, same-sex couples, single people, you name it. And it costs about, perhaps this is higher now with inflation, but generally about $150,000 to $200,000. On the surrogate side, who's doing this? Generally poor women getting paid about $40,000 to $80,000, sometimes less than that, $20,000 to $25,000. There's no regulation at the federal level in the United States, and the states are literally all over the map on this. And where I come from in California, it's super permissive. It's the wild, wild west. A little bit about these people who are involved in surrogacy before we go on. Let me state right off the bat that the stories of couples struggling with the deep pain of infertility are nothing short of heartbreaking. Surrogacy then can seem like an attractive option to infertile couples because the genetics of at least one of the parents can be passed on to the child. And parents who commission a child through surrogacy certainly want the child. The longing for children is woven into the fabric of our very selves, of our very being, and that desire is good. Related to that, here's the argument that many people make. Given the circumstances, how hard these children are wanted and how hard they're fought for, children born of surrogacy will be deeply loved, and that love will outweigh any other harms that they might suffer. The argument goes, the kids are all right, they have to be, they are so very wanted. I'm interested in exploring that assumption a little bit, but let me be clear. I am not questioning the love and dedication that these parents have for their children. I am rather interested in how surrogacy affects the other people involved in the surrogacy arrangement, particularly the birth or the gestational mother and the child. I want to do it by sketching out two paradigms at play in surrogacy and to evaluate those two paradigms from the lens of Christian anthropology. And here are your two paradigms. Number one, autonomy, and number two, dualism. About autonomy, I mentioned that surrogacy arrangements are arranged through contract law. So it would be good to take a little time to think about the surrogacy contract itself. And I'm a contract law professor again. I hope you'll forgive me for nerding out a little bit on this part. But the ruling view in the law is something that non-lawyers would be familiar with. It's the idea of autonomy. Where contract law used to be oriented toward virtue, now it's all about, it's reduced to autonomy, parties' freedom of contract. As long as the parties are of age and of sound mind, what they want to contract for, hey, it's between consenting adults, is the idea. Now that's contrasted with the old view of natural law, the idea of contract law in Western law tradition, which throughout the history of Western legal thought was concerned with or oriented toward virtue, including, for example, commutative justice or promise keeping. St. Thomas Aquinas says that, very famously, law is an ordinance of reason for the common good made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. Aquinas was interested in the telos of human beings, in the fulfillment or completion or perfection of our nature. Our reasoning nature is what makes us human, what Scripture means by imago Dei, our being made in the image and likeness of God himself. So we partake in the divine nature, in that reasoning or creative nature that's unique to us as man. In other words, a Christian anthropology, a Christian view of the human being, is to say that our imago Dei means that our reasoning nature, native to our being, is not only a reflection of, but also participatory in the divine nature. Now, another word for the fulfillment of our telos or end is flourishing. And flourishing has to do with reasonableness, which Aquinas defines as doing and pursuing what is good and avoiding what is evil. An aspect of that reasonableness is the virtue of prudence or practical reasonableness. But what is it that people do in a contract? Through a contract, people deliberate about, choose for, and create a previously non-existent state of affairs relating to their resources and an exercise of their rational capacity. So the practical reasonableness in contracting is precisely the good of the capacity to deliberate about valuable possibilities and prudence. Prudence in choosing well between these possibilities, that is, making choices that are oriented toward reasonableness, again, good to be pursued and done, and that's evil avoided, and that's a necessary ingredient in human flourishing. And to go full circle with the virtue and flourishing talk, the word virtue is from the Latin virtus, the quality of being a man, a vir. Virtue is about the full measure of who man is created to be, being fully human. A flourishing person is a virtuous one, and there's no way around that, and the etymology of the word bears witness to it. In fact, for Aquinas, flourishing is a state of blessedness that is a form of intellectual union with the divine creator. Now, of course, people exercise their freedom of contract in forming contracts. Now, here are your two conceptions of freedom. Freedom is now commonly understood as the unshackling of limits, of being free from restraints. But this is what we would have called licentiousness. Traditionally, freedom has to do with freely choosing the good, freely choosing well with the presence of and within limits and boundaries or fences. This is, of course, harmonious with a Christian anthropology of freedom for the reasoning being that's properly oriented toward the objective and transcendent, true, good, and beautiful. That's a view of the true, good, and beautiful that stands in judgment of the human and not the human that stands in judgment of it, or the human that self-defines what the true, good, and beautiful is. One can think about boundaries in a contract this way then. There's moral absolutes or exceptionalist norms, like we may not contract to murder someone, we may not contract to enslave someone. That's one boundary. And another one is a boundary that's more like determinatio. It's not deductive, more permissive and rationally compelling, but still derived from natural law or the requirements of practical reason, but they do require context-dependent judgment. If we think about it that way, freedom of contract too has degenerated from being oriented to practical reasonableness or prudence, which is oriented to flourishing, to nothing short of my contract, my choice. If I want it, I may enter into that contract. So, with that backdrop of a quick tour of contract law, past and present, unabashedly, contract law too has gone the way of licentiousness. The licentiousness understanding of the freedom in freedom of contract. It's now divorced from any conception of the good or the bad. Specifically for surrogacy, it is that if I want it, I may enter into that contract philosophy that now rules the day. One of the earlier cases in surrogacy is Johnson v. Calvert, of course, the California case from 1993. And sure enough, in that case, the court says the party's intent is going to govern here. So it is a type of my body, my choice argument. On the other side, my baby, my choice, maybe. That's what we're more familiar with. Now, it is the case that generally poor women, many of whom are military wives, are the ones signing up to be surrogate mothers, while commissioning parents tend to be wealthy people at that price point, right? But considering the disparity in bargaining power between the poor surrogate woman and the wealthy commissioning parents, how kosher is that consent of that surrogate woman if we talk about freedom of contract? Is there economic exploitation involved? Some have observed the uncomfortable congruence between organ selling and the exploitation of the poor and surrogacy as organ renting, and for a good reason, I think. Now, of course, contract autonomy or party consent for both parties in privity of contract, as we would call that, that's we can say, or some would say, okay, I can see some semblance of it there. But what about the child's consent? More on that soon. So, I once gave this talk at Notre Dame Law School, and the students there actually pushed back on how I think about this, about not being a moral absolute, that I think is determinatio. They said, well, maybe it is a moral absolute, but for now, perhaps I can say it's not as clear a case as do not murder somebody, do not enslave somebody. But I do think definitely it's within the province of prudential application of what we should not do. So how might we figure out the prudential or the application of practical reasonableness in surrogacy oriented toward what is good? That brings me into the second paradigm at play in surrogacy. If that was the first one, and this is now the second one, dualism. Now, to answer a question I brought up earlier, what would be oriented toward what is good in choosing well in surrogacy, toward what would be good for us as humans? In a Thomistic fashion, I'd like to explore a little bit of what makes us man, a little bit of who we are to the level of our nature. Who are we as humans? What is our view of the human based on the truth we know from both reason and revelation? That is to say, what is anthropology? What is our Christian anthropology at that? Our understanding of the human. There is a givenness to our procreation and origins due to our creatureliness. This giffenness is morally significant. We humans, we are embodied beings. We are our bodies. We're not minds or souls who happen to have bodies. This view is the Aristotelian Thomistic hylomorphism, and it understands the human person as one of substantial unity of mind and body. The body is an essential and intrinsic aspect of personal identity rather than a mere extrinsic instrument or appendage of the self. The view of the body as an appendage of the self is actually super common in our time. Applying body-self dualism to the human person, Princeton University's Robert P. George explains that it is a form of Gnosticism in which, and I quote him now, the material or bodily is inferior, if not a prison to escape, certainly a mere instrument to be manipulated to serve the goals of the person understood as the spirit or mind or psyche. The self is a spiritual or mental substance. The body is merely a material vehicle. You and I, as persons, are identified entirely with the spirit or mind or psyche, and not at all, or in only the most highly attenuated sense, with the body that we occupy, or are somehow associated with and use, end quote. So the Aristotelian Thomistic hylomorphism is the view that's opposite of that very common view of dualism of body and soul. Now, that is how God created us, this body-soul unity. This is part of the nature that he has given us, part of the giffenness of our creatureliness. This means that if we are to be most true to our nature, or become fully ourselves, or become fully human, or for us to be flourishing, it must be through embodiment. We must honor our bodily nature and bodily reality. There cannot be any other way, because there's no possibility of flourishing apart from being true to the reality of how God has created us, that is, as embodied beings. Stated another way then, Christian anthropology is embodied anthropology. And if that's the case, that anthropology must be one that honors our in the flesh, literally incarnate nature. This brings us to, we humans are, or should be, begotten, not made. The ethicist Alfred O'Donovan submitted that when we make rather than beget a child, we consign him to the status of a product. We become the maker, the one with superior status. The child is the product, the inferior. And he said, and this is from his book, Begotten or Made, ? Human Procreation and Medical Technique. He said, our offspring are human beings who share with us one common human nature, one common human experience, and one common human destiny. But that which we make is unlike ourselves, in that it has a human maker. It has come to existence as a human project. It's being at the disposal of mankind. It is not fit to take its place alongside mankind in fellowship. To speak of begetting is to speak of the possibility that one may form another being who will share one's own nature and with whom one will enjoy a fellowship based on radical equality, end quote. When we beget a child, we receive the child as a human being equal to us. We receive the child as a gift. We become participants in creation, cooperating with God, the Creator. But when we manufacture a child in a lab, we manipulate how he comes into being. We treat him as a product of our design, as if he were something unlike and unequal to ourselves. Well, let's consider what is necessary for a child to be born through surrogacy. I'd like to explore that a little bit, first looking at the surrogate mother and then looking at the child. So, about the surrogate mother. These days, again, gestational surrogacy has just about replaced traditional surrogacy. In traditional surrogacy, the genetic mother is also the birth mother, but in gestational surrogacy, the baby is conceived through IVF, using the genetic materials of the commissioning parents, or a donor, or a combination thereof, and then that's subsequently implanted in the birth mother's womb. These processes are shaped by a technological culture that seeks to abolish constraints, that unshackling of limits again, pushing the limits of what is possible without stopping to ask whether we should do everything that we can do. One bioethicist and theologian, Gilbert Meilander, calls this the tyranny of the possible. If we can do it, we should do it. This technological culture treats human nature and human bodies as raw material out of which something is to be made or manipulated. This view has been applied not only to sex, but also to reproduction. If the pill has made possible sex without babies, IVF and surrogacy have made possible babies without sex. Now, in surrogacy, the woman carrying and giving birth to the baby is not even referred to as the birth mother or the surrogate woman. She is referred to as the gestational carrier. And yet, the embodiment of pregnancy matters a great deal. But that reality is totally eluded by the word carrier. She is reduced, she is flattened to an oven. That's it, that's all she is. What I mean by that is while the baby is his own being, he does grow inside the womb of the birth mother. There is a shared life between the two and a resulting bond from it. During pregnancy, what the mother eats, drinks, and experiences affect the baby in the womb. I had midwives who would always tell me, careful with anger or strong emotions. Your baby feels that. Don't be so stressed out. Surrender. Careful with what you eat. But one medical sociologist says, and this is a quotation, if you are pregnant with a baby, you are the mother of the baby that you're carrying. End of discussion. The nutrients, the blood supply, the sounds, the sweep of the body, that's not somebody standing in for somebody else to that baby. That's the only mother that baby has. End quote. To be sure, though, the child's genetic makeup, often that of the commissioning parents, is indisputably important. It is fundamental to his or her identity. And a plug for CBHD, I want to talk about that tomorrow. But the growing science of epigenetics and fetal origins has allowed us a glimpse of the bond forged in the womb. For example, oxytocin is a hormone that is present in higher quantities in pregnancy and released in labor and birth. And that imprints the birth mother on the baby, and correspondingly, the baby on her. What's more, and this is fascinating, it's called fetal microchimerism. Scientists have also found DNA from male babies in their mother's brains, potentially remaining there for life. Other studies have observed a similar phenomenon, the presence of male DNA in mothers' bloodstreams as long as 27 years after birth. So one science writer put it this way: the connection between mother and child is ever deeper than thought. These findings suggest that a child is quite literally a part of the mother long after she carries him in her womb and gives birth. So when your mom says, "You'll always be my baby, you'll always be a part of me," turns out she means that literally. Who knew? How about social studies? What do they have to say? The data there confirm what we know from science. Many women consider themselves to be a mother to a baby they carry in their wombs, even if the baby is not related to them genetically. The gestational tie binds them to the baby much as a genetic tie would. To carry a child and sustain his life in the womb is to be a mother. That's not just in her head. She is objectively a mother to the child. Now, going back to that prudential question or the application of practical reasonableness for surrogacy, and that question has to do with the orientation toward what is good and away from what is evil. What then would be for the birth mother's good or for her flourishing? Put another way, and I'd like to think not a surprising way for us at Trinity, if we Christians are called to love our neighbor, and love is willing the good of the beloved, what then would be the good of the birth mother, who is our neighbor? We must honor that reality of motherhood with her, the reality of embodiment as part of our human nature. The embodiment of shared life matters, and it testifies to the biological parentage of the birth mother. Really, the term biological parents in surrogacy ought to include the birth mother as well as the genetic parents. A birth mother loses a part of herself when her intimate connection with the child is severed. And that is precisely what surrogacy does by design, that's suffering. In surrogacy, the child is intentionally and contractually severed from a relationship with her. Now, some arguments against what I would say here would say, oh, a surrogacy arrangement is really just a service contract. But to my mind, that misses the point. They are also disturbingly similar to the argument made by proponents of slavery in the 1800s. They used to say, oh, we're not in the business of buying and selling human beings. They said, we're in the business of the labor of human beings. Now, it's interesting to note that opposition to surrogacy makes for strange bedfellows. The Catholic Church opposes it, as do some feminists. Some wealthy, progressive European nations outlaw it, as do some poor, conservative Asian countries. One thing in common, though, is the recognition that treating the birth mother as a carrier is reductionistic of her whole person. It is demeaning and dehumanizing. She is reduced from a whole person to a commodity, a rent-a-womb, raw material. Surrogacy exploits the birth mother by objectifying, commodifying her. In the words of Jennifer Law, who is the founder of the Center for Bioethics and Culture, she said, women aren't just empty vessels. The womb isn't arbitrary. Women aren't breeders. So, if surrogacy is demeaning and dehumanizing to the birth mother, objectifying her and reducing her to a commodity, surrogacy is not for her good. It does not contribute to her flourishing as a human being. These women are not served well by surrogacy, and we fail in our duty to love this neighbor through surrogacy. I said I wanted to look at that from the woman's perspective and the child's perspective. So here comes the child. The other human being caught up in all this, even if he's not in the privity of the surrogacy contract. That person is, of course, the child that's born under the surrogacy arrangement. As to the child, with regard to that prudential question again, or the application of practical reasonableness, what would be for his good, for his flourishing? To restate the question from earlier, only now looking at the child, what is necessary for a child to be born through surrogacy? Perhaps we can start with the eggs and the sperm that are used in IVF if you're using donor conception. Donor eggs, again, used in surrogacy sometimes have different price tags. Did we know this? The eggs of an Ivy League-educated donor command more money in the market. I'm talking upwards of $50,000 for these so-called Ivy eggs, but sometimes only $2,500 for regular eggs. The eggs of a blonde, thin, and tall woman are more sought after in the market, as well as the eggs of a woman of a certain ethnicity, like if you're Jewish, if you're East Asian, or Indian. So for everybody else, I guess, not so much. And you heard that right. I'm not kidding. The baby, like the womb, has become a commodity. The same kind of calculation goes for donor sperm too, just lower in price because the sperm is plentiful and way easier to obtain. It's a smartphone and porn in one room. I'm now quoting Oliver O'Donovan. He said, for whatever may be said about gametes, children are not property to be conveyed. The notion that one might undertake to become the parent of a child in order to alienate one's parental relation to another implicitly converts the child from a person to a commodity, end quote. So, the manufacturing of children in IVF and surrogacy commodifies children, but it also puts our culture on a slippery slope toward eugenics. Here's what I mean by that. If children are already manufactured anyway, why not manufacture them with desirable characteristics and specifications? Why not produce children who are more and not less perfect? In fact, we do that. We pick and choose the eggs and sperm based on some traits and not others, and we do that with embryos too. What sex would you like the baby to be? Eye color, hair color, height, body type, medical history, IQ and academic pedigree, likelihood of survival? We pick some embryos to be implanted in the surrogate mother's womb, but not other embryos. Now, those embryonic humans, let's be clear, they are tiny human babies who don't make the cut. They are trashed or else indefinitely frozen. This picking and choosing and trashing reveals the commodification of the human in IVF, and small wonder. IVF's predecessor in third-party reproduction is artificial insemination, whose roots were in animal husbandry for improvement of stock. The quest of things like higher yield of the dairy cow, the looking for semen of stud horses or prize bulls. So Dr. Robert Latu Dickinson, who was the American Gynecological Society in the 1920s, president of that society, He declared that artificial insemination had enormous potentialities of betterment of the race. He was for sterilizing the criminal and the sick and the mentally ill. Few are the degrees of separation between eugenics and IVF. Earlier, we said the baby is imprinted on the birth mother through the shared life of pregnancy, labor, and birth. But that's also true of the birth mother being imprinted on the baby. If part of who we are as human beings is our memory, including our epigenetic memory, which manifests itself in our physical bodies, what does surrogacy deny in depriving the child of his birth mother? Leon Cass, for a long time, he was just up the road from here at Chicago, observed that our genitalia points to our children and our navel points to our forebears. The child's navel is a reminder to him that he owes his life to his birth mother. For the child born of surrogacy, though, there would be a longing in place of memory of his birth mother. Every time he sees his belly button, it is a reminder ever present in his body that his birth mother is always going to be a stranger to him. We are our bodies, after all. We are not ghosts in machines, as if our souls are the real us and our bodies are just meat suits, as dualism would suggest, meat suits. Or, in Mary Harrington's memorable phrase, meat Legos, in her book, Feminism Against Progress. We are, rather, body-soul composites as embodied beings. As Pope John Paul II says, the body reveals the person. We don't have bodies, we are our bodies. And the body of the child testifies to the parentage of the surrogate mother. There's also the matter of high stress for the newborn baby when he is removed from the birth mother, along with the deprivation of her breast milk for him. You heard about them a little bit, midwives. I live in Southern California. I had home births and the whole thing. And my midwives weren't necessarily Christian. They were just really interested in babies and births, healthy births, things like that. And I was really surprised that my midwife stopped me and said, you really need to learn how to breastfeed. This is back before the baby was even born. I was still pregnant. You really need to learn how to breastfeed, because your breast milk, there's a particular smell that your baby knows. That's you because of your breast milk smell, and not any other woman. Your voice, the baby, I think we know this as Christians from pro-life advocacy, your voice is what the baby has heard inside the womb and not anybody else's voice. That's well documented in research. In surrogacy, the earliest and most powerful bonds formed between a child and his birth mother are, by design, severed, disregarded, and rendered irrelevant. But these are matters of the child's identity, genesis, and well-being. They are being intentionally discarded. Research shows that children who learn that they were conceived using surrogacy often start showing adjustment problems around the age of 7. Now, the problems have not been characterized as a psychological disorder, but the onset of adjustment problems at the age of 7 is interesting because it coincides with the age at which children begin to make sense of the concept of biological inheritance. So the findings suggest that the absence of gestational tie between commissioning mother and the child is harmful to the child. IVF and surrogacy introduce what has never been done before, splitting the child's biological mother in two, the genetic mother and the birth mother. The fragmentation, in turn, fragments the child and harms him. He cannot now be raised, known, and loved by his biological parents. That is, his genetic parents and his birth mother. You might be thinking, but isn't surrogacy a little bit like adoption? Actually, the two could not be more different. In adoption, the biological parents are replaced by the adopted parents to redeem what is an already broken situation. What the adopted parents do there is nothing short of heroic. But the loss of the biological parents is not sought out in adoption. In surrogacy, by contrast, the loss of the birth mother, and again, depending on the procedure and whether it utilizes donor egg, sperm, or both, the loss of one or both of genetic parents as well, that's the very design and nature of the arrangement. By the way, there's a thick irony in all this. In such a consent-obsessed arrangement, to realize that the child has consented none at all And to any of this loss and fragmentation for his life is irony. We see then, whereas adoption serves the child, surrogacy serves the commissioning parents. What about the increasingly loud argument that we have a right to have children? Well, we see that surrogacy is not oriented toward the good of birth mothers and children. And while the desire for children is natural, deep, and good, and the absence of these children can be deeply disappointing and painful, I submit that desire must be weighed against the costs of surrogacy. Wanting to have children does not mean that we have a right to have children. If having children is a right, then children are going to be owed to us. If we are entitled to them, we are gonna get them come hell or high water, including by less than kosher means like surrogacy. It is also true, by the way, that babies are wonderful. Each child is good and loved and unique and unrepeatable. But the good and worthy end of life does not justify any which means to procure it. If surrogacy is damaging to the child, if it reduces him to a commodity and dehumanizes him, then surrogacy is not for his good, it's not for his flourishing. Since that child is also most definitely our neighbor, and again, love is willing the good of the beloved, we do not then will his good in surrogacy. We fail to love him as our neighbor in surrogacy. And that is true even when the commissioning parents have the very best of intentions. These harms are inherent in surrogacy. The idea that the bond between birth mother and child matters little is reductionistic and materialistic. In spite of the great love of their commissioning parents, the kids are not all right. We owe these children more than this. For this last bit of my talk with you, I want to ask, where do we go from here? Let me end with two of the newest trends in surrogacy, and lastly, where I think we ought to go from here. So here are the two newest trends. The first one is social surrogacy. And these are women who just don't want to go through pregnancy, although they are well able to. We're not talking about infertility here. So, and why? Maybe pregnancy will make them fat. Maybe they're busy professionals. Maybe they look at their calendar at work and go, I can't possibly take the time off. Maybe pregnancy is a hassle. So they say, let's just pay a surrogate to bear a child for us. That's called social surrogacy. Now, abhorrent as it is, with the thinking that we have a right to have children, that children are owed to us, social surrogacy is a logical step. The second newest trend is called the whole body gestational surrogacy. About a year ago, a philosophy professor from Norway made an argument on the journal Theoretical Medicine and Bioethics, and she called her idea whole body gestational surrogacy. And her idea is women who are in persistent vegetative state or are brain dead could be used as surrogates to gestate babies for commissioning parents. Second time I'm saying this, but you heard that right. So here, we're way past my body, my choice. We're just dispensing with autonomy because, of course, the woman can't consent because she's not even conscious. The good news, I think, if there's any good news here, is that the dualistic, even the Gnostic assumption in surrogacy is now materializing, clear for everyone to see. The bad news is that it's ugly as ugly gets, and it's a thing of horror. That assumption in surrogacy that we are not embodied beings in our body-soul unity as we actually are, but that the real person is the soul separable from the body, is now loud and clear. And here's what I mean by that. Following Gnosticism's inherent logic, the body is nothing more than a hunk of meat. So forget the song and dance about obtaining the woman's consent to be a surrogate. Let's just use the oven, pop in the bun, and turn it on. Denying embodied anthropology, no consent is needed because the body can't consent if the real person in the form of her soul is a goner. The assumption or the message is she's brain dead anyway. She's in a persistent vegetative state anyway. Now, where I think we ought to go, what I think we need, for what it's worth, is a recovery of natural law or virtue ethics and Christian anthropology and jurisprudence and bioethics. What is oriented toward our good and our flourishing, which entails the necessary recovery of hylomorphism, the recovery of understanding of embodiment as part of our human nature. Andrew Walker at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary had a tweet once that I really liked. He said, "Make hylomorphism great again." To that, I want to say amen. Now, in some church traditions, we are now in the pre-Lenten season, having just walked through the 3 seasons that focus on the Incarnation. And that was Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany. Throughout those seasons we just passed, focusing on the Incarnation, as we do every year, we sat with Mary in her pregnancy. We contemplated the coming of the long-expected Jesus. She would have seen alterations of shape, that phrase from C.S. Lewis earlier, of her own body. She would have felt it. She lived through it. From the Annunciation to the Visitation, and then on to the journey toward Bethlehem, she would have felt the weight of being great with child. And of course, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus had a particular face, a particular eye color, a particular shape of the face. His hands and feet had a shape that was his. In the words of the poet Malcolm Guite, of Jesus the newborn baby, Malcolm Guite said, "Christ clings to Mary, fingers tightly curled." We'll contemplate those hands and feet, that particular face, that particular forehead, bruised and bloodied from the crucifixion and the crown of thorns, as we go up to Jerusalem with Christ this coming Lent, starting next week, on to Holy Week, Maundy Thursday, and Good Friday, that particular body being buried, Christ being well and truly dead. We'll contemplate and worship Christ in the body on that glorious Easter day and throughout Eastertide. Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept, St. Paul says, in whose pattern then we will follow. For, St. Paul continues, so also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. We'll contemplate and worship the risen Christ then ascending to heaven. In human form he ascended, in the body, where he sitteth on the right hand of the Father. And how? Not sloughed off from the body, but ruling and reigning there at the right hand of the Father, whose kingdom shall have no end, in the body. Going back to the Incarnation, Mary did not choose these particularities of Jesus' person, his eye color, the shape of his face, his body. She did choose to say yes to God, but in doing so, Mary simply received Christ, begotten of his Father before all worlds, now incarnate in the flesh, in the body, as Jesus was given to her. As I think we've seen, this posture is so different from surrogacy. The goodness of the body of the child, and thus the person as he is, not as we choose him to be, is antithetical to the logic of IVF and surrogacy. Contra the posture of receiving the child as a gift from the hands of God, surrogacy makes consumers and commodities out of us. Man, bearing the imago Dei and participating in the divine nature, whose incarnate nature is ennobled by the incarnation of Christ, is properly begotten, not made. But surrogacy turns on this and causes man to be made, not begotten. In sundering the conjugal and procreative unity, surrogacy dishonors our incarnate nature. What a modern Gnostic thing that is. Going back to Paris Hilton's baby reveal, there's perhaps a sense of surprise. Here's a baby out of a hat. Or so it may have seemed to the commissioning parents and family. Pregnancy's incarnate reality is skipped wholesale. It's like magic then, which, going back to C.S. Lewis, is precisely what he says modernity is like. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis writes, prophetically, for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, end quote. Where the real is embodied, surrogacy is anti-reality and anti-incarnational. If, as I am submitting, the posture of receiving each child as a gift, not as a prerogative or a right, is the posture that we need to recover in our age, then none is more apt than the words of the psalmist in Psalm 127. Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. Thank you.
Okay, are we live? Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that excellent discussion of surrogacy, and especially the connection to embodiment and the ways in which robust Christian anthropology really, I think, speaks into the issues of surrogacy. Would invite those of you in person to go ahead and raise your hand. We'll just have the speaker repeat your question, so rather than passing a microphone around. For those of you online, go ahead and add your questions to the live chat, and we'll read those off as they're available. Go ahead. Yeah.
I've seen online who have talked about using any standard for kind of
A question, I want to make sure I get this right. Is there any standard to make sure that surrogacy is done ethically, especially when we're using women in poor countries abroad? Okay. And my position is there is no ethical way to do that. We are exploiting the woman. As it stands, we are paying that woman a lot less. If you're wondering the discrepancy of the money that the commissioning parents pay and what the woman gets paid, where's the rest? Well, the lawyers, I'm a lawyer, the doctors, the fertility clinics, they have to make money out of this. It's huge. But let's just say hypothetically that these couples are paying $200,000 and we're paying the woman $200,000. Nobody else makes any money, not possible, hypothetically. We are dishonoring our embodied nature, both the woman's embodied nature and the child's embodied nature by doing that. And surely this is not healthy for the commissioning parents, is what I would think. Again, infertility, I should say, it touches my family. So when I say there's deep pain, we're not just dismissing that. That is true and it's real and it really hurts. And I'd like to underscore many of these commissioning parents have the very best of intentions. But I submit that these harms are inherent in surrogacy.
Question from online, several actually around international laws, regulations on surrogacy. If you could speak to that a bit more, how that's evolved over time.
Yes, it is all over the place. Let's see, I want to say, maybe 10-ish years ago, there's that famous case from Thailand. I think it was an Australian couple, and it was a Thai woman that they picked as a surrogate mother. The Thai woman was pregnant with twins, the genetic babies of this Australian couple. And one twin was healthy and the other twin was not. The Australian couple took the one and left the other twin with a poor surrogate in Thailand. So Thailand has come down against surrogacy, Cambodia, several countries in Europe, not us in the United States. There's also the issue or the question of how to enforce that. How do you do restrictions on the visa? If somebody comes home with a baby, what do? You don't want to confiscate the baby and say you don't get to go home with these parents. So it's a very thorny, very complex issues. I wish I had a simple, pat answer. There isn't one. I think it really a recovery of how people think about human beings and babies would be the way to go. And we Christians should be at the forefront of that.
Go ahead. So there's some doctors, even in the area, that are talking about a way to approach, I know this is different, but IVF as, okay, we won't have all these extra embryos. It'll be more expensive, but you can do IVF. by just creating two and planting them immediately. I'm guessing from your talk, I know where what you'll say, but I just question, like, what are your thoughts? Is that a moral absolute no? Or if there's no extra life being created and discarded, is there ever a potential route for that?
Yes, question is, well, is there a way for us to have embryos that we are going to use completely? And so we're not thrashing any human beings or freezing them indefinitely. Is that an ethical way to go? And you guessed correctly. I think we should craft the best case scenario. Hypothetically, we've got a loving, devout Christian couple, right? And so they have a number of embryos. They're gonna use every one. Even the word use, how else do we have that verb there? We shouldn't be doing this to human beings. But let's just say that we're going to implant every single one. Oliver Donovan talks about how this already creates risks that we take on, and we're not God the creator. We don't get to do this. But if you were to bracket that aside, which I'm not saying we should, but just for purposes of this discussion, we bracket that aside. And we say, well, there's no embryos now going into the freezer indefinitely. There's no embryos being trashed, right? This is still pro-life, right? And I think if we're looking at it through church traditions, this is harder for evangelicals to hear, that doing that still dishonors our embodied nature. The womb isn't arbitrary. Jesus, it's not just the time, but where he was in Mary and all that process, it is the ennobling of the incarnation, is one way to think about it. Of course, we don't have a Bible verse, right, evangelicals, that say, thou shalt not commit surrogacy. It does not mean that we do not understand or we cannot understand what scripture principles are teaching us. Another way is to go through what Oliver Donovan says, that when we make a something, we make that thing as a product. That's not begetting a human being anymore, that's manufacturing something. He has strong words to say about that. John Finnis, associated now with Notre Dame, previously with Oxford, says when we do that, we have a master-slave relationship, and boy, that's hard to hear, I think.
A clarification online to the, you mentioned the whole body gestational surrogacy. Someone just wanted to clarify that that was a thought experiment versus has that been done?
Well, the professor lady from Norway doesn't make it sound like a thought experiment. She is, I think, really making a proposal. I don't know whether that's been done. I would hope not. If it's been done in some remote recess of the earth somewhere, at this point, dare we say, we would not be surprised, although we would be very grieved.
Thank you. Go ahead, in the back.
If we are not using humans as commodities, say if a couple is going through infertility and her sister or someone in close family wants to help them with surrogacy, would that be acceptable?
Yes, I think this is now another version of the same hypo. I forgot to restate the question. What if we've got a wonderful couple and we're using this embryo, we're implanting it in the couple's sister, perhaps, or the mother's sister, and let's just say no payment. So this is truly altruistic surrogacy, which is rare, on the rare side. It's normally for money. And would that be acceptable? Well, we took away some of the objections, I think, for sure, but we still dishonor our embodied nature. We're still splitting that mother in two. We've got the two sisters as the mothers with relation to the baby, to the child. Growing up, perhaps, looking at his belly button, that birth mother is not a stranger, assuming relations stay good. There's generally difficult waters to chart ahead with regard to feelings and emotions about this child. But if what we know about human nature, our embodied nature holds, then I submit that's not the way to go.
Another question coming from online. What do you expect to be the progression of surrogacy over the next few years in the U.S.? You mentioned the social surrogacy and this whole body proposal, and also that the market will climb over $100 billion annually. So if you want to offer any thoughts on that.
I wish I had a crystal ball. Our idea of autonomy, what I want, I get, what feels good, I get to do, is getting only stronger. That Gnostic impulses that we have, it is in the air that we breathe, it is in the water that we drink. I think, interestingly, through COVID, and people started to realize, hey, embodiment matters. I'm really hurting when I'm not with other people, even though I see them on the screen on Zoom or FaceTime or something. People are starting to feel that. And perhaps there would be surprising developments, but given how strong the currents are with regard to autonomy and Gnosticism, I don't see it getting better. Now, the Inquirer online did not ask about this, but if I may add, a lot of times Christians hear this and say, what can I do? Am I supposed to write to my representatives? Well, you certainly, don't let me discourage you, certainly may, perhaps should. Some of us are going to be called to testify between legislature bodies. I mentioned Jennifer Law, she's done that. A lot of times they don't do anything with that, totally ignore these testimonies and move on. But I think most of us are actually just neighbors, friends, and family of those who might be contemplating something like surrogacy or even IVF, maybe without surrogacy. Often this comes up in conversation. Some of you might be pastors, and perhaps your congregates come up to you and ask, what do you think? I think that is something that we Christians have a huge role to play. And we can't just say, well, if it doesn't say, like we did in 73, the Bible doesn't say, thou shalt not commit abortion. Where's the verse for that? The Bible doesn't say, thou shalt not commit surrogacy. Where's the verse for that? It doesn't mean, again, that we can't sit down with the whole counsel of Scripture and think, okay, what does it mean to be created human like this? What does it mean that Jesus became one of us in the Incarnation and did not slough off that body? He's currently the right hand of the Father in human form. We'll see him again when he comes back in the body. If we believe in the resurrection, if the body matters a lot, if it's paramount, what does that say about how we conceive and how we procreate? I think discussions that we have with friends, neighbors, and families carry a great deal of water. And certainly, this is our calling as Christians, to speak the truth in love.
If I could follow up on that a little bit, one of the things that we were a bit surprised about a few years ago at the center was the rise of Christian surrogacy organizations. And one of the things that we encountered in my time at the center, and I'm not sure if Dr. Epinett has encountered this over the past couple of years, but requests from pastors how to respond to individuals in their congregation who appeal to things like the value of children that we see in Scripture and this idea of bringing the gift of life to these families that are infertile or unable to bear children. How would you respond to them in terms of guiding pastors to respond to those individuals in their congregations?
Yes, earlier I quoted, it's the Sisters of Life that said each baby is good and worthy and valuable and unique and unrepeatable and loved. And that's true. We Christians get that babies are a good thing, right? This helped our pro-life understanding. This has helped our pro-life advocacy. I think the error might come from thinking that if it's a good thing, if it's a good end, then any means would be okay to get there, that the end justifies the means. But it's a robust Christian tradition that has said, no, actually both ends and means have to be righteous. Both ends and means have to be just. And that's a big deal. And so that's what we mean, that's what I'm submitting when I say babies are a wonderful thing, gift of life. But we don't get to go get it just using any means. But now, should pastors say, go ahead and have children, be fruitful and multiply? Absolutely. Should pastors then counsel these couples in their churches to adopt? I think so. Now, what I thought the question was going to go to was, how about embryo adoption? I think that's a great thing. I do wish we had more protections in place so that we are not going to go willy-nilly into it and making embryo adoption to basically a baby market, which, if we're not already there, it can very easily get there. If a couple were to try to adopt a child or a baby who's already born, there's all these laws in place to make sure You're not doing it for you, you're doing it for the child to make sure that we're not exploiting the mother or the child. We don't have those for embryo adoption. Does that mean we shouldn't go through with embryo adoption? I don't necessarily think so, but I think we need robust protection so that it doesn't become a human market in babies, in embryos, who are babies, just really little.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Adeline, for a terrific talk. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with one. I have a more pastoral attitude, and I know that it may be hazardous to ask that to a lawyer, but how would you counsel those who are the result of surrogacy? Imagine that I were the result of surrogacy. What would you say to me? Would you say to me, poor thing? Would you say you need perhaps prayer? You need to put it before God and maybe confess about the sinful nature of your coming to existence? How did you ever think about that aspect?
Excellent question. What pastorally would we say to a human being who was conceived through surrogacy? And I think you said, what would you say to me? Would you say to me, poor thing? Would you say to me, you need to pray? And when I first was researching and developing this, this was a baby of the Madison program at Princeton. And it was a little luncheon, and I presented kind of the beginnings of this to a group of people there. And one of the people present was not born through surrogacy, but was born through donor conception. And this kind of question came up, but in a different way. The question there was, but if you're born through surrogacy, aren't you glad you're alive? You otherwise would not have existed. And this participant in the discussion said, you know, I'm donor conceived, and you can actually be really grateful that you're alive, and at the same time be grieved at how you came into being. And I can't say it better than that. There's another participant, very wise, who said that he once went to a pro-life event, and there was a woman there who was born through rape. And the woman said, again, the same thing. I'm very happy I'm alive, but I'm very grieved at how my life came into being. And so I think I would say, poor thing, but not in a way that diminishes the person. I think it's a calling. There's an exemplars in Scripture about sitting down and weeping with somebody. I think this is a source of lamentation. I think this is a source of grief. I think the person should sit before the Father God and grieve. I think we should do that with the person. And we should not say, oh, well, pray about it in a diminishing, dismissive way. We really do mean it. We really do believe in prayer. That while that person, as the Sisters of Life said, that person is unique and loved and unrepeatable, the manner in which that person came into being dishonored that person's nature, who is made in the image of God, and that is source of grief. And I think we can say both, that we should not do this moving forward, and that we genuinely love and care and have compassion, literally suffering with. So we sit down and lament and grieve properly, and it may take a lifetime before the God who created us and who loves us.
You mentioned the ways in which we could offer pastoral guidance. You did also mention earlier the ways that some of us may be called to testify or to provide more public square engagement. In those arenas, what do you find to be some of the most compelling arguments from the public square standpoint?
What seems to work the best, and I wish the answer is, read St. Thomas Aquinas' legislature houses and be ye concerned and be ye converted. Logical arguments don't seem to carry the day, unfortunately. Stories do, narratives do. And so it's been the case, Jennifer Law, Katie Faust, them before us, that's her organization, have put together and sometimes brought these people who are donor conceived, or perhaps they're born through surrogacy, and they speak to the legislatures. This is my story. This is how it hurts me, and I'm a real person. We shouldn't be doing this moving forward to people who are not yet in existence. Now, whether that's always persuasive, apparently not. Legislatures often say, sounds good, next, and then do this law that are completely upside down. But I think as Christians, we should do both. I think we should talk about, down to the level of our nature, from what we know from reason and revelation, and have stories. I think it should be both. It should not be an exclusion of the other.
Other comments or questions here in person?
So one other question is, but maybe that would take you too far, but we all know that there's a wet nurse, right? That's a woman who breastfeeds another's child. Is that in a similar but less intense way a similar problem? Because when you're breastfeeding in ancient times, it could be years, right? Would you have sort of the same problems with that relationship between mother and child?
The question was, what about wet nurses? Would that be analogous to the problem of surrogacy? In ancient times, people breastfeed for years, and American women, if we could bring those ancient times, make breastfeeding great again. Bet you didn't think it was going to go here. And so is that analogous with surrogacy? I would not put it in the same plane of problems at all. When we think about ancient times, it's generally, and help me out, those who know this historically, it's generally children of aristocracy. Is that right? If you work as a wet nurse because you work for somebody of a great house or something like that, and perhaps that came from children needed to perpetuate the family line, but they need to be around but not heard, and it's really hard to do this, and so you employ somebody to do that. That wasn't the best for the child, but that's certainly better than ancient times. There was no formula, better than letting the child die. And so the child's already in existence. I think we do have fewer problems here with regard to embodiment and the dishonoring of our nature. I would not put it in the same plane.
Question regarding some of the developing technology around synthetic or artificial wombs and how that may impact any of these issues related to surrogacy. Would you see that as preferable? Would you see that as also problematic? Yeah.
Yes. I'd like to chew on that a little bit, but if we're gestating babies in synthetic wombs, again, I think we go down to the level of what is our nature, what are we designed for, and how have we been designed? I think we also start questioning what is much bigger talk, much bigger subject. I'm not here to talk about that beyond the scope, but this is all related to what is man and what is woman. Abigail Favale, The Genesis of Gender, what a fantastic book. And she really grapples with this question of our age, what is a woman? And if Abigail Favale is right, I think she is, about her definition of a woman, it has to do with procreation, with that power, that capacity in your body. If we go to a machine instead, we are making we're making ourselves more machine-like and less human-like. So forget being fully ourselves, being fully human, forget flourishing. If we're appropriating more machine-like characteristics into ourselves. A great book that would speak to the idea of we are voluntarily making ourselves more machine-like and less human is A Web of Our Own Making, The Nature of Digital Formation by Anton Barba-Kaye. And he was one of the Madison Fellows that year. That's how I knew about the book, and I just finished reading the book that just came out, Cambridge University Press. He doesn't go necessarily talk about the machine, the gestating machine, but I think it has a lot of those same concerns.
Question in terms of the some of the legal clarifications. What happens if the contracting parents don't want to keep the baby after it's born, and also what happens if the surrogate wants to keep the baby that they have gestated?
Very ugly things. If the commissioning parents don't want the baby, it's basically the baby's screwed. The surrogate mom is often stuck with the baby, and perhaps stuck isn't the right word, because a lot of times they say, no, this is my baby. Now I'm very poor a lot of times, and this is really hard financially, but of course, this is my baby. And the second question is, what happens if the surrogate woman wants out? There's all these clauses about how to get out of the contract. It's definitely oriented toward the benefit of the commissioning parents and not the woman. And what the woman wants just doesn't carry water. More of the big news type of cases or stories seem to be things like the woman, they find out the baby has some defect, and the commissioning parents say, we want the baby aborted, and the woman says, I don't want that, and they go to court. The woman generally loses if the court goes by the autonomy idea of contracting. They'll look at the contract and says, well, I see your signature here, contracting woman in surrogacy. You say that you agree that what they say, what the commissioning parents say, goes. Well, this is one of those instances. So, very ugly.
To someone who's trying to make the argument that God is the author of life, and that how would babies be born through IVF or surrogacy if God didn't intend it?
Yes, so what would I say to somebody who says that God is the author of life and that some babies are born through surrogacy, and you said at the end, IVF, I'm sorry, and you said at the end, that's how God intends it, or how?
So, like, if God is the one who, yes, God aspect of it, so he has to be allowing it.
Yes, TEDS people, you tell me how the discussion of evil goes at TEDS. There's all this suffering and all these things that are not right, and even evil in the world. Is God really God, that these things are such? Now, I know it's a very big discussion that has to do with his son being sent to die on the cross and resurrecting the third day, and then we are called to redeem that world with him, and the culmination of which is the already not yet. He started it, and it's not yet. It's inaugurated eschatology. Is that right? Is that what you guys call it? And that we see this completely redeemed when he comes back. Just because it's there doesn't mean God intends it.
Before we go to the question over here, just a clarification online. The author of the book that you had mentioned, What is a Woman?
Abigail Fafale, The Genesis of Gender. I think when she wrote it, she was still part of George Fox in Oregon, and she is now part of the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame.
Thank you.
Terrific book.
It's kind of a comment, but what you're saying about, especially when there are arguments between the parents that are contracting and the woman who is a surrogate, it really emphasizes the fact that the baby is nothing more than a product. When it comes to, especially from your perspective, legally arguing about things, you are talking about property, which is why it is so akin to slavery. Whether you're looking at the surrogate as a slave or you're looking at the child as nothing more than property of, oh, that's not what I wanted, let's try again, or that's not the condition I was looking for, and so that's now your problem, I don't want that. But also, as it relates to abortion, you have the same issue where you have, that's my product that you're carrying, and I want it back. I mean, it's absurd, but it emphasizes that you're reducing something just to property.
I think that's more of a comment, and I want to say amen. The comment is this gentleman sees that how I see surrogacy, the woman and the child, is that we're making them products, especially the child. You see the product-like nature of it when I call it a commodity, and how this is the same kind of argument that in abortion, people say, this is what I get to do with this product of conception, for example. Absolutely. So I think the same idea with my body, my choice, and autonomy, consent-based contract, when we don't think about what a contract should be oriented toward, and how it's always two adults consenting in a contract can't be bad, as if that's the only litmus test, as if that's the only thing that matters. Absolutely. My body, my choice, my product, my choice. We're not seeing that baby as accorded the full human worth and dignity that each person has by virtue of his or her nature, that is made in the image of God, that embodied nature is part of it. Absolutely.
We have several comments, questions online related to baby markets, baby business, and you touched on some of that. I don't know if you would like to comment a bit more about the connection with that in terms of broader fertility efforts and whatnot.
What year was it? I think it was in I want to say the 80s. There's a great law review article. I think it was a Harvard law professor, and the name escapes me. It's a very famous law review article. She talked about how babies should be inalienable, kind of like duh for Christians, but takes the time and develops the whole argument. I want to say in 2006, a Harvard Business School professor by the name of Deborah Spar wrote the book literally called The Baby Business. She talks about the baby market not from a Christian perspective. She's just it's descriptive. This is what is. This is the market that already is. And I draw some statistics and citations from what she had to say. And yeah, the market exists. Eugenics was all the rage before World War II, and Nazism comes in and says, oh yeah, sounds great, we're doing that too. And after that, it dampened a bit the glories of eugenics, especially we look around in the United States and say, well, maybe that's not such a great idea. But we're living it right now, aren't we? If we're naming prices for certain eggs based on the characteristics of the moms or the woman who has those eggs differently. It's already there. There's all kinds of very chilling remarks, data research about these kind of things. When a couple sits down, let's just say the wife is infertile and the husband then gets to look at a donor catalog. I think it was a fertility clinic worker said, I find it really interesting. The husband often picks an egg donor who looks nothing like the wife, but inevitably a pretty one. And I think we're already naming the price of human beings.
Want to just put in a plug for a book that you mentioned a couple of times in the presentation. Oliver O'Donovan's book, Begotten or Made, went into a new edition in the past year or two, so just highly commend that work if that's something that you've not engaged with in the past. I just want to thank Professor Allen again for her time this evening, for thoughtful comments, for your engagement with the questions. Would invite you back again for the March 14th lecture, the Kilner Lectureship with Dr. Loris Kaljan, and thank you for joining us this evening. Good night.